Good morning, everyone. In this flash talk, I will present some preliminary results from my PhD project that comprises a paleoecological study of the early Pleistocene of Olduvai Gorge, in which I use clay minerals as climatic proxies. The overarching question that this project aims to investigate is whether it is possible to establish how the Olduvai Basin landscape was occupied by different early Pleistocene hominins, and therefore it is fundamental to understand the environmental context in which these hominin groups inhabited this region by investigating, for instance, how much this landscape changed and which patterns of paleo-environmental changes can be identified and how they varied. To this end, I am studying the mineralogy and chemistry of sediments from lacustrine and paralacustrine deposits at Olduvai Gorge. Olduvai Gorge is a river incised valley situated on the eastern branch of the East African Rift System in northern Tanzania, highlighted by the white circle. During the Pleistocene, the Olduvai Basin accumulated a lake. Known as Lake Olduvai, it was mostly a saline alkaline lake. My project focuses on a time frame between 1.9 and 1.3 million years ago, an interval within the deposition of beds 1 and 2, which is a part of the Olduvai record that includes evidence for the coexistence of 2 or more hominin species, and that represents a period of climatic and environmental changes within the Olduvai Basin. To better understand the environmental context of this occupation, an objective of this project is to study the chemical changes in the Lake Olduvai as a function of the climatic changes that occurred in the Olduvai Gorge landscape. And climate-derived chemical changes in lakes are manifested in alterations of lake salinity, the latter of which are resisted in the mineralogy, especially in the clays. This focus on clay stems from the fact that they are significant archives to reconstruct paleo-environmental changes. The identification of particular clay minerals and their chemistry can provide information on water chemistry, salinity, degree of leaching, paleo-temperature, paleoclimate, and on the nature of the deposits. For my project, samples were collected from 6 different sites throughout the gorge and from different units in the stratigraphic sequences of beds 1 and 2. Both bulk sediments and fine clay fractions are being investigated, though the focus is on the latter. Mineralogical analyses were carried out with X-ray diffraction and Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy, and chemical analysis were done with inductively coupled plasma atomic emission spectroscopy. The interaction of tufaceous materials with alkaline waters produces clays, and depending on the conditions, also zeolites and other silicate minerals, including potassium feldspars. This mineralogical range is clearly observed in the X-ray diffractograms of the bulk sediments, in which was also identified the presence of calcite, quartz, fluorite, olivine, and sodium and calcium feldspars. Additionally, most of these samples also show wide and low intensity peaks of smectite, which is a group of clays, and it's highlighted to the left of the graphic in green. These 2 samples, clay 2017 and Joseph 5, the only 2 from upper bed 1, stand out from the overall group. Both yielded the highest values of magnesium oxide, which in many instances is more than the double resisted for the other samples, and the inverse was recorded for both aluminium and iron oxides. The calculation of their structural formulas also showed the predominant trioctahedral phase, which is also observed in the infrared spectra and the X-ray diffractograms. So these 2 samples have a magnesium-rich and trioctahedral clay phase present in them. This characterization is important because aluminium and magnesium-rich clays provide crucial information on the expected transformations that occurred in the Olduvai Basin. Magnesium-rich clays are associated with saline and arid conditions, and increases in magnesium have been associated with paleolake shrinkage. On the other hand, aluminium-rich clays are associated with freshwater and humid conditions, and increases in aluminium have been registered for periods of lake high stands. So this association with magnesium-rich clays and arid conditions for these samples is consistent with previous paleoecological interpretations for their deposition below TAF1F. These studies have indicated that the largest reduction in size occurred between TAF1D and 1F. And for those studies that focused on floral remains, they have suggested a predominance of edaphic grasslands in a steppe-like landscape for the eastern lake margin area, and for a period that has been described as very dry, and when the Pio Lake would have retreated from its maximum area to the west of the junction area, which is to west of the blue circle. So my project aims to build on previous clay studies that have been developed at the Olduvai Gorge for the past few decades. And the use of clay mineralogy as a climatic proxy has the potential to offer another object of study for paleoecological studies within archaeology to complement records from fauna and flora remains. And further work in my project will involve the cross-examination of this ecological analysis and interpretation of mineralogical and chemical data against previously published literature on the paleoanthropological and archaeological records of Olduvai Gorge to better understand how this early Pleistocene landscape was occupied. Thank you.
Bovids emerged during the Neogene and continue to disperse and radiate almost on a global scale, constantly adapting to ongoing ecological transitions, especially during the Late Miocene. Pikermi is one of the richest fossil-bearing localities of the Upper Miocene of Europe and has been extensively excavated since the 19th century, revealing a great abundance of fossil vertebrates and comprising a significant range of bovids. Latest among these efforts are the annual excavations organized by the University of Athens from 2008 and continuing to this day under the direction of Professor George Theodorou and under the auspices of Rafina Pikermi municipality. In this slide, we can see views of the excavation site. Excavation activity is focused in two sites, depth PV1 and PV3. PV3 is considered to correspond to the historical Pikermi dig site and is dated at about 7.29 to 7.33 million years ago. The nearby PV1 site is somewhat younger at 7.27 million years. The studied material comes from those two sites and is comprised of 110 craniodental specimens. The material is housed in the Museum of Paleontology and Geology of the University of Athens, the permanent exhibition of paleontological treasures of Pikermi, and the Rafina Pikermi Cultural Center. The comparative material used comes from the collections of the University and the Natural History Museum of Vienna. Additionally, measurements and descriptions from relevant literature were also used. As for the methodology used, an assessment of the craniodental morphology of the specimens was performed by macroscopic examination in conjunction with osteometric measurements and their statistical analysis. The terminology and measurements used follow the works listed in the bottom right. Concerning the systematic classification of the material, the identification performed places most of the studied specimens in 7 known species from the locality, plus 1 additional unknown species which could nevertheless be identified at the generic level. Lastly, 5 specimens could not be safely identified due to their poor state of preservation. We start with the bovid subfamily Bovinae, with representatives from the tribe Boselaphini. These are the species Tragoportax amalthea and Myotragocerus valenciensis. The rest of the material belongs to the subfamily Antilopinae and contains members of the tribes Antilopini, Ocerini, and Caprini, as well as 2 more species of uncertain classification within the group, which are still well documented in literature. As we have seen, the results mostly validate previous research, with some notable exceptions and new insights. In the upper graph, the species Eocerus yothii is compared to the smaller size Eocerus atropatinus. Certain specimens seem to display significantly lower anteroposterior horn diameter values. Combined with the slightly less curved appearance of said specimens, These values could be attributed to sexual dimorphism, something which has already been hinted at in previous publications. As for the lower graph, the comparative specimens chosen represent species which are similarly sized to the studied material, of which Sporadotregus parvidens is a species known from the locality but also curiously absent in the present sample. The studied material itself falls close to the values of the former species, but its qualitative morphology precludes its attribution to it. The material was rather found to correspond morphologically to the species Sporadotregus vasili. It is important to note that this species is present only in the younger PV1 site. Furthermore, established species of the Pikermian fauna, such as Protorix carolinae and Prostrepsiceros rotudicones, are also absent from the studied sample. Last but not least, a preliminary paleoecological evaluation was performed by classifying the minimum number of individuals according to feeding habits. In the corresponding pie charts, we can see the near total dominance of mixed feeding individuals. Of note also is the total absence of browsers in PV1. In closing, the observations stemming from the study of the material are as follows. Indications of possible sexual dimorphism were found in specimens of the species Eosirus orthei. A new Sporadotregus species, not corresponding to the one already known in the locality, was identified and found to possess morphological similarities to Sporadotregus vasili. The differentiation in bovid species content from site to site, including the historical site, could point to temporal fluctuations of the faunal composition in the locality. No apparent conflict with existing paleoecological reconstructions of the locality, which indicate the transition from closed woodland-type environments to open savanna-type ones, could be found. All of the above constitute preliminary observations, and further study is shown to be more than warranted. This concludes my presentation. Thank you all for your attention.
The results of Neanderthal and carnivore, the origin of reindeer assemblage at Vergisson IV site, Saône-et-Loire in France. The small site of Vergisson IV is located in Bourgogne-Franche-Comté, in Saône-et-Loire, close to the famous site of Solutré. The site was occupied at the end of the Middle Paleolithic. It was first excavating from 1957 to 1962 by Jean Combier, and then new field surveys were undertaken by Sylvain Soriano in 2021 in order to clarify the chronology of the site. And the final assemblage is dominated by reindeer. So this study focused on the reindeer remain, has used classical method of zooarchaeology and taphonomy. The main objective was to obtain data on reindeer population and on reindeer accumulation process and on Neanderthal occupation. Vergisson IV sequence contained two main archaeological units, the upper unit with possibly Kina Mousterian and the lower unit with Le Valois Kétinaip. The minimal number of individuals is 19 in upper unit and 31 in lower, identified on the basis of the dental use work. We have shown in both units the dominance of adult and subadult reindeer. There are currently too little data to estimate the sex of the individuals, and the seasonality of reindeer mortality is between spring and autumn for upper units, and between spring and autumn, with a small proportion of this occurring between late winter and early spring for lower units. The assemblage is mainly composed of hemimandible, zygopod, and metapodials. There is also a good representation of isolate teeth and distal long-boned epiphysis, and only few bone antler and long-boned soft fragments. That is possibly due to a preferential selection during a first excavation. The taphonomic study permits to highlight a mixed occupation with anthropogenic and carnivore modification. Indeed, we have both the presence of cut marks and carnivore tooth mark with pit, puncture, and score. The tooth mark measure highlight a majority of small and middle-sized carnivore, probably canids, fox, or wolf, which indicated scavenging actions. The remains are well preserved and have not been heavily destroyed by carnivore. The human action corresponding in majority to disarticulation and deflection, and with more skinning in lower units than in upper units. There are no burn bones in this remain studied. So the mixed presence of human and carnivores, with a possible close presence in a short time, superposition and coexistence of two types of marks is observed. Both anthropic and carnivore marks are visible on 5% of NESP reindeer remain for the upper unit and 7% for the lower. On one remain sequencing revealed the anteriority of anthropogenic impacts. To conclude, we are dealing with the site narrow and steppe era with both and strong anthropic impacts and a close and mixed occupation with the carnivore, probably canids, over time. All the data faunal analytic highlight a possible short duration of the human occupation of the sites with a low proportion of in situ debitage indicate by the scarcity of nuclei. Vergisson IV may therefore have functioned as a regular hunting camp. Finally, the lasted excavation have also made possible to put forward the hypothesis that the Vergisson IV site was located in a large diaclase without growth, with a moderate redistribution of remain. This work aimed to be dependent in particular by carry out the whole faunal spectra and by studying the material from the new excavations. Comparison between the old and new excavation could then be made to better understand the organization and the function of the site and to verify our hypothesis. Thank you for your attention.